November 1943, 30,000 feet above central Germany. The air is thin enough to steal consciousness. Engines struggle for oxygen. The cockpit is a sealed box of metal and glass, colder than anything on the ground below. Frost crawls across instruments. Oxygen masks stiffen. Breathing becomes deliberate, mechanical. American fighters hold formation. Below them, bomber streams cut across the clouds, steady and exposed. German radar stations track their movement. Interceptors climb to meet them, engines straining, pilots already fighting fatigue before the first shot is fired. At this altitude, survival is never assumed. A frozen oxygen line means seconds. A cracked mask means collapse. A stalled engine means an endless fall. Axis planners believed these conditions imposed a ceiling on warfare. Machines might reach this height, but men could not remain there long enough to fight effectively. Doctrine was built on that assumption. Strategy depended on it. Yet American pilots keep flying. The escort bombers not at the edge of endurance, but beyond it. They remain where doctrine says withdrawal should occur. They accept cold, hypoxia, and failure as part of the mission. From command rooms across occupied Europe, Axis officers study the same reports. Escorts staying longer, engagements lasting higher, losses mounting without forcing retreat. What they are witnessing is not recklessness, it is endurance weaponized. To understand why Axis Command found this so difficult to believe, it is necessary to step back, before the frozen masks and numbed hands, to the assumptions that defined how the air war was supposed to be fought. When the European air war began in earnest, it was governed by assumptions formed in peacetime studies and early combat experience. Altitude was considered both a shield and a filter. The higher an aircraft flew, the safer it was from ground fire, but the more hostile the environment became for the pilot inside it. By 1942, the United States Army Air Forces committed fully to a doctrine that challenged those assumptions. The Daylight strategic bombing campaign over occupied Europe required heavy bombers to operate at extreme altitudes, often between 25,000 and 30,000 feet. At these heights, bombing accuracy improved, and exposure to anti-aircraft fire was reduced. The cost was human. Aircraft cabins were unpressurized. Temperatures dropped to levels that froze exposed skin in minutes. Oxygen systems became the only barrier between consciousness and blackout. Pilots and crews operated in an environment closer to the upper limits of human survival than to normal combat conditions. German air doctrine had evolved differently. The Luftwaffe emphasized interception efficiency, quick climbs, and decisive engagements. Fighters were designed to reach altitude rapidly, strike with force, and disengage before fatigue and exposure took their toll. Prolonged operations at extreme altitude were considered dangerous and unsustainable. Axis Command believed this gave them an advantage. Bombers, it was assumed, could be isolated. Escort fighters would be forced to withdraw early due to fuel constraints, cold exposure, and oxygen strain. Once unprotected, bomber formations could be attacked repeatedly by interceptors diving from above. Early engagements appeared to confirm this logic. American bombers suffered heavy losses. Fighter escorts were limited in range and endurance. Crews faced not only enemy fire, but frostbite, hypoxia, and mechanical failure. Yet American leadership did not abandon the strategy. Instead, they accepted the environment as part of the battlefield. Equipment was refined incrementally. Heated flight clothing improved. Oxygen systems were redesigned and repaired between missions. Training emphasized recognition of hypoxia symptoms and emergency response under cold stress. None of this made high-altitude combat safe. It made it possible long enough to complete the mission. Axis Command began receiving reports that challenged expectations. Escorts were staying closer to bomber formations. Fighters were climbing higher than anticipated. Interceptions were becoming contested earlier and lasting longer. Altitude, once thought to impose a natural limit on American operations, was no longer doing so reliably. And as these reports accumulated, Axis planners faced a growing unease. The environment they believed would protect them was being endured rather than avoided, and that endurance was beginning to alter the balance of the air war. By early 1943, the air war over Europe had entered a phase where endurance mattered as much as firepower. Missions stretched longer. Targets lay deep inside occupied territory. Escort requirements expanded beyond what early American fighters had been designed to sustain. American pilots flew at the edge of their aircraft's capabilities and beyond the limits of human comfort. Fuel had to be conserved carefully during long climbs. Oxygen regulators were monitored constantly. The cold was relentless, creeping through flight suits and gloves, numbing hands and slowing reaction times. Axis Command observed these conditions with confidence. Luftwaffe medical assessments had long warned against prolonged exposure above certain altitudes. German pilots were trained to limit time spent in the most hostile layers of the atmosphere. Interception profiles emphasized brief, violent engagements followed by rapid descent. The assumption was simple. American pilots could not remain at altitude long enough to maintain continuous escort. That assumption began to fail. American escort tactics evolved. Pilots adjusted climb rates to conserve oxygen. Formations rotated positions to reduce prolonged cold exposure for any single aircraft. Crews learned to function despite partial numbness and reduced sensory feedback. Equipment failures were anticipated rather than treated as anomalies. New aircraft extended this endurance further.
The arrival of longer-range fighters gradually erased the gaps German planners relied upon. Escorts no longer faded away at predictable points. They remained overhead during critical phases of bomber exposure. Axis intelligence reports reflect growing concern. Escorts were present at altitudes once considered impractical for sustained combat. Engagements began earlier and extended longer than doctrine anticipated. German fighters found themselves forced into prolonged contrasts in an environment that degraded everyone equally. What unsettled Axis command was not just American bravery, but American acceptance of attrition. Losses, whether from combat, exposure, or mechanical failure, were absorbed into a system designed to continue operating regardless. German resources did not allow the same flexibility. Every experienced pilot lost to fatigue or exposure weakened interception capability. Replacement pilots entered combat with fewer hours and less conditioning for extreme altitude flight. Altitude had been expected to act as a regulator, enforcing balance by punishing whoever stayed too long. Instead, it became a test of which Air Force could endure the punishment longer. By the spring of 1943, Axis planners faced an uncomfortable realization. If Americans were willing to treat human limits as variables rather than boundaries, then the air war would not be decided by ceilings or cold, but by persistence under conditions no doctrine had fully prepared for. And as this realization spread through Axis command structures, it set the stage for a confrontation where endurance itself would become the decisive factor. At extreme altitude, the most vulnerable component of any aircraft was not its engine or wings, it was the pilot. American fighter pilots operated in unpressurized cockpits where temperatures routinely dropped below -40 degrees. Oxygen deprivation slowed thought and dulled perception. Hypoxia did not arrive dramatically, it crept in quietly, turning routine decisions into fatal ones. Axis medical officers understood these limits well. German doctrine treated the human body as a constraint that could not be ignored. Pilots were not expected to remain effective indefinitely under such conditions. American pilots did. They learned to recognize the earliest signs of hypoxia, slight confusion, narrowing vision, delayed responses, and to correct them instantly. They accepted numbness as normal. Frostbite became a risk calculated into mission planning rather than a reason to disengage. Angle 2. Aircraft pushed beyond comfort, not capability. American fighters were not designed to make high-altitude combat survivable. They were designed to make it possible. Oxygen systems were imperfect, regulators froze, masks cracked, heated gear malfunctioned. Pilots adapted by constant monitoring, by improvisation, by treating equipment failure as an expected event rather than an emergency. Axis observers noted that American aircraft continued to operate despite visible strain. Escorts did not withdraw when systems faltered. They compensated and stayed. The machines endured because the pilots endured. Angle 3. Axis doctrine under strain. German interception doctrine relied on predictability. Bombers flew high, escorts withdrew early. Fighters struck during isolation. When American escorts remained, this structure unraveled. German pilots were forced into longer engagements at altitude, increasing fatigue and exposure. Interceptions became contests of endurance rather than precision. The advantage of doctrine eroded with every prolonged fight. Axis command saw the shift clearly. The air war was no longer unfolding according to established limits. And as American pilots continued flying where survival was never guaranteed, Axis planners faced a reality they had not prepared for, one where endurance mattered more than efficiency, and persistence could undo even the most carefully constructed doctrine. To Axis command, the most unsettling development was not the technical performance of American aircraft, but the message conveyed by their continued presence. Escorts appearing where doctrine said they should not were more than a tactical inconvenience. They were a signal. German controllers tracked American fighters remaining at altitude far longer than expected. Engagements that were supposed to be brief became extended. Withdrawal windows closed. Every minute the Americans stayed forced Axis pilots to make a choice: fight longer in punishing conditions or disengage and concede space. This altered behavior across the Luftwaffe. Interceptions became cautious. Timing slipped. Pilots hesitated, aware that prolonged exposure carried invisible costs that could not be recovered quickly. Angle 5. Replacement versus depletion. American air strategy treated loss as inevitable. Training pipelines were built to replace pilots continuously. Exposure injuries, fatigue, and attrition were absorbed by scale. Axis command did not possess that margin. Every experienced pilot lost to frostbite, hypoxia-related error, or exhaustion represented an irreplaceable reduction in capability. New pilots arrived with fewer hours and limited conditioning for extreme altitude flight. Altitude had been expected to act as a regulator, enforcing balance by punishing whoever stayed too long. Instead, it became a test of which Air Force could endure the punishment longer. By the spring of 1943, Axis planners faced an uncomfortable realization. If Americans were willing to treat human limits as variables rather than boundaries, then the air war would not be decided by ceilings or cold, but by persistence under conditions no doctrine had fully prepared for. And as this realization spread through Axis command structures, it set the stage for a confrontation where endurance itself would become the decisive factor. At extreme altitude, the most vulnerable component of any aircraft was not its engine or wings, it was the pilot. American fighter pilots operated in unpressurized cockpits where temperatures routinely dropped below -40 degrees. Oxygen deprivation slowed thought and dulled perception. Hypoxia did not arrive dramatically, it crept in quietly, turning routine decisions into fatal ones. Axis medical officers understood these limits well. German doctrine treated the human body as a constraint that could not be ignored. Pilots were not expected to remain effective indefinitely under such conditions. American pilots did. They learned to recognize the earliest signs of hypoxia, slight confusion, narrowing vision, delayed responses, and to correct them instantly. They accepted numbness as normal. Frostbite became a risk calculated into mission planning rather than a reason to disengage. Angle 2. Aircraft pushed beyond comfort, not capability. American fighters were not designed to make high-altitude combat survivable. They were designed to make it possible. Oxygen systems were imperfect, regulators froze, masks cracked, heated gear malfunctioned. Pilots adapted by constant monitoring, by improvisation, by treating equipment failure as an expected event rather than an emergency. Axis observers noted that American aircraft continued to operate despite visible strain. Escorts did not withdraw when systems faltered. They compensated and stayed. The machines endured because the pilots endured. Angle 3. Axis doctrine under strain. German interception doctrine relied on predictability. Bombers flew high, escorts withdrew early, fighters struck during isolation. When American escorts remained, this structure unraveled. German pilots were forced into longer engagements at altitude, increasing fatigue and exposure. Interceptions became contests of endurance rather than precision. The advantage of doctrine eroded with every prolonged fight. Axis command saw the shift clearly. The air war was no longer unfolding according to established limits, and as American pilots continued flying where survival was never guaranteed, Axis planners faced a reality they had not prepared for, one where endurance mattered more than efficiency, and persistence could undo even the most carefully constructed doctrine. At extreme altitude, the most vulnerable component of any aircraft was not its engine or wings, it was the pilot. American fighter pilots operated in unpressurized cockpits where temperatures routinely dropped below -40 degrees. Oxygen deprivation slowed thought and dulled perception. Hypoxia did not arrive dramatically, it crept in quietly, turning routine decisions into fatal ones. Axis medical officers understood these limits well. German doctrine treated the human body as a constraint that could not be ignored. Pilots were not expected to remain effective indefinitely under such conditions. American pilots did. They learned to recognize the earliest signs of hypoxia, slight confusion, narrowing vision, delayed responses, and to correct them instantly. They accepted numbness as normal.
Angle 6. When the environment became a weapon. Above 25,000 feet, neither side controlled the conditions. Cold, thin air, and mechanical strain punished everyone equally. What differed was tolerance. American pilots treated the environment as an enemy to be endured. Axis doctrine treated it as a boundary to be respected. This difference reshaped the campaign. American presence forced Axis pilots into conditions they had been trained to avoid. Exposure became cumulative. Fatigue spread across units. Effectiveness declined gradually but persistently. By mid-1943, Axis command understood the shift clearly. The air war was no longer about altitude advantage or speed alone. It was about which side could continue operating in an environment that offered no mercy. And as endurance replaced doctrine as the deciding factor, the stage was set for a turning point that would permanently alter the balance of the air war over Europe. The turning point did not arrive as a single battle marked on a map. It emerged through repetition, through reports that grew steadily harder to dismiss. By the summer of 1943, Axis Air Command faced a pattern that contradicted every assumption they had relied upon. American escort fighters were no longer appearing briefly and withdrawing. They were present throughout entire missions, climbing with bombers, holding position at altitude, and remaining during the most dangerous phases of interception. German planners reviewed mission logs and pilot debriefs that told the same story. Escorts were waiting above bomber formations. They engaged early. They did not disengage when exposure and fatigue should have forced them down. This was not a technical surprise. Axis Command understood the capabilities of American aircraft. What they had not expected was the willingness of American pilots to remain functional in conditions that steadily degraded human performance. At extreme altitude, every engagement carried layered risk. Oxygen systems struggled under sustained demand. Cold stiffened control surfaces. Reaction time slowed. Fatigue accumulated minute by minute. American pilots accepted these conditions as part of the mission profile. German pilots were now compelled to do the same. Interceptions that once relied on brief, decisive strikes turned into prolonged contests fought in thin air. The longer these engagements lasted, the more they eroded the Luftwaffe's advantage. Recovery times increased, sortie rates declined, small errors multiplied. Axis Command attempted adjustments. New interception tactics emphasized rapid, head-on attacks to minimize exposure. Ground-based defenses were expanded to compensate for declining fighter effectiveness. Experimental aircraft and high-performance variants were rushed into service. None of these measures restored the earlier balance. The realization began to settle in command rooms across Axis-held Europe. The Americans were not trying to avoid the edge of survivability. They were operating within it deliberately. Endurance had become part of their strategy. Altitude, once considered a barrier, had been transformed into a shared battlefield, one where persistence mattered more than doctrine. And as this reality took hold, Axis planners faced the uncomfortable truth that the air war was no longer being shaped by who could reach higher or strike faster, but by who could remain present longest in conditions that punished every weakness. The effects of this shift accelerated through the latter half of 1943. As American escort coverage expanded, Axis Air Command watched interception effectiveness decline across entire regions. Bomber formations that once fractured under pressure now held cohesion. Losses continued, but targets were struck with increasing regularity. The decisive window, when bombers could be isolated and overwhelmed, was closing. For Axis planners, the shock was not sudden, it was cumulative. Escort fighters now occupied the same altitude bands as interceptors, forcing engagements to occur in air where both sides suffered equally. At these heights, time became the enemy. Oxygen flow struggled to keep pace with exertion. Cold penetrated layers of protection. Fatigue degraded precision and judgment. American pilots endured this deliberately. Axis pilots were compelled to match it, but without the same tolerance for loss. Prolonged exposure increased errors. Recovery between missions lengthened. Sortie rates fell.
The cost of each interception rose beyond what could be sustained. Medical assessments within the Luftwaffe reflected mounting concern. Exposure-related injuries increased, combat fatigue accumulated faster than it could be managed. Training pipelines could not produce replacements conditioned for extreme altitude combat at the rate losses demanded. Command adjustments followed. Emphasis shifted further toward anti-aircraft artillery. Interception tactics were simplified to minimize time spent at altitude. Aircraft were dispersed to preserve what remained of the fighter force. These measures slowed American progress but did not stop it. By late 1943, Axis Command understood that altitude no longer imposed limits on American operations. The environment itself had failed as a defensive tool. The Americans had absorbed its punishment and continued operating. Endurance had replaced altitude as the decisive factor. From this point forward, the outcome of the air war was no longer in doubt. What remained was a matter of time. How long Axis defenses could continue operating under conditions that extracted cost without offering relief. And as the Luftwaffe's ability to contest the skies steadily eroded, the consequences of this endurance-based struggle began to shape not only the air war, but the broader course of the conflict itself. By early 1944, the consequences of prolonged high-altitude combat were visible throughout the Axis air defense system. The Luftwaffe was still operational, still launching interceptors, still contesting American formations, but it was no longer regenerating strength. Losses had become cumulative. Experienced pilots were increasingly scarce. Those who remained carried fatigue from months of sustained operations in hostile conditions. Exposure injuries were no longer isolated incidents. Frostbite, oxygen-related impairment, and exhaustion reduced combat readiness even when aircraft returned intact. American operations, by contrast, showed continuity rather than recovery cycles. Bomber streams continued to reach deeper targets. Escorts remained overhead for entire missions. The cold did not lessen. Oxygen systems still failed. The difference lay in institutional tolerance. American air doctrine had absorbed these risks into its operating model. Axis command recognized that the environment had reversed roles. Altitude had been expected to restrict American capability. Instead, it restricted Axis endurance. Interceptors now faced repeated missions in conditions that eroded effectiveness faster than they could be restored. Recovery periods lengthened. Sortie rates declined. Small degradations compounded. Strategic adjustments followed. Greater reliance was placed on ground-based defenses. Anti-aircraft batteries expanded rapidly to compensate for declining fighter interception success. Fighter deployments were concentrated around priority targets. Engagements were limited to scenarios where success appeared likely. These measures slowed the pace of American operations but did not reverse the trend. Psychologically, the shift was decisive. Axis pilots entered combat knowing escorts would be present at altitude. The expectation of isolation, a cornerstone of earlier interception planning, had vanished. Every engagement now carried sustained exposure and diminishing returns. American pilots continued flying where survivability was uncertain, not because conditions improved, but because endurance had been institutionalized. Cold injuries were treated as routine. Equipment failures were anticipated. Mission completion took precedence over comfort and safety margins. Axis command could see the trajectory clearly. The air war was no longer balanced. Each mission cost more than the last, and as this imbalance deepened, it became evident that the Luftwaffe was no longer losing battles. It was losing the ability to continue fighting at the level the campaign demanded. As 1944 progressed into its later months, Axis Air Command confronted a reality that could no longer be disguised by tactical adjustments or localized successes. The Luftwaffe still existed, but it no longer controlled the tempo of the air war. It reacted rather than shaped outcomes. Interceptors continued to rise to meet American formations, yet each mission extracted a cost that could not be repaid. Veteran pilots were gone. Those who remained carried cumulative fatigue that no amount of discipline could erase. Exposure injuries reduced effectiveness even before combat began. Decision-making slowed. Errors increased. American escort fighters, meanwhile, had normalized the extraordinary. Missions lasting hours at extreme altitude became routine. Cold and hypoxia were treated as environmental constants rather than exceptional dangers. Equipment failures were anticipated and managed. Replacement pilots entered a system designed to absorb loss and maintain operational pressure. Axis planners understood the asymmetry clearly. Where American endurance translated into sustained presence, Axis endurance translated into depletion. The environment, once expected to impose natural limits, now enforced imbalance. Each additional month of operations reduced the Luftwaffe's ability to contest the skies. Strategic consequences followed swiftly. American bombing accuracy improved as escort presence reduced disruption. Industrial targets were struck repeatedly. Transportation networks degraded. Aircraft production struggled under sustained pressure. Airfields came under increasing threat. The ability to regroup or recover diminished with every passing week. By the time Allied ground operations expanded across Western Europe, Axis air resistance had already been weakened by years of exposure-driven attrition. The air war had shaped the battlefield long before troops crossed borders. Axis command did not misjudge American aircraft. They misjudged American tolerance for human cost. Altitude had not broken American pilots. It had revealed a difference in how each side understood limits. As 1944 drew to a close, the Luftwaffe's role shifted from contesting control to delaying the inevitable. The air war had been decided quietly, without a single decisive moment, by those who continued flying where survivability was never guaranteed. And with that realization firmly in place, what remained was reflection on what this endurance-based struggle had changed, not just for the war, but for the future of aerial combat itself. The disbelief felt within Axis command did not come from a single aircraft, a single mission, or a single tactical failure. It emerged through repetition, from the realization that American pilots continued to fly in conditions that doctrine had defined as unsustainable. The air war over Europe revealed a shift in how modern conflict would be fought. Victory was no longer determined solely by speed, altitude, or technical refinement. It depended on systems capable of absorbing human limits and continuing to operate where endurance replaced safety. American pilots did not overcome the environment. They endured it. Cold, hypoxia, fatigue, and mechanical failure were not eliminated. They were accepted. Survivability became a negotiated condition rather than a guarantee. That acceptance reshaped the campaign. Axis air doctrine, built around efficiency and preservation of experienced pilots, could not adapt quickly enough to a conflict that demanded sustained exposure. What had once been an advantage, respect for physiological limits, became a constraint. The environment ceased to function as protection and instead enforced imbalance. By the time this was fully understood, correction was no longer possible. Altitude no longer offered safety. Cold no longer imposed restraint. Endurance itself had become a strategic asset. The legacy of this realization extended beyond the Second World War. It marked the emergence of warfare defined by continuous operation in hostile environments, where success depended not only on technology, but on the ability to sustain pressure without pause. High above Europe, in air where survivability was never guaranteed, the outcome of the air war was decided quietly, not by a single decisive battle, but by those who kept flying when others could not. And in that persistence, the balance of the war tipped irreversibly.